It all began abruptly without any apparent reason. I woke up in the middle of the night in my apartment, feeling an unexplained fear. As I lay there trying to gather my thoughts, a sudden creak echoed from the kitchen. The distinct sound of the cupboard door squeaking when slightly opened. Perhaps I wasn't fully awake yet, as I almost ignored it and continued sleeping. It was only in the morning that I remembered the strange nocturnal sound. However, upon inspecting my apartment, I found nothing unusual, leading me to believe it might have been a dream. The following night passed without disturbances, and I heard nothing. However, in the morning, I discovered the pantry door was wide open. I couldn't recall opening it, but I tried not to focus on such details, attributing it to some forgetfulness or subconscious action. 2 days later, another unpleasant surprise awaited me. On this occasion, I found all 3 hanging cabinets in the kitchen wide open. It became evident that something strange was happening in my apartment, and I needed to address it. Yet, with a busy schedule, I couldn't immediately devote time to investigate. Now, I was somewhat alarmed by the ongoing events, but I still hesitated to take any action. One night, I heard knocks and rustling from deep within the apartment. However, I was too tired to check what was happening. In the morning, I found my sneakers in disarray, looking slightly worn, placed a few meters apart. The realization dawned on me that someone or something was tampering with my belongings. That morning, I rushed to work, but resolved to uncover the mystery surrounding my apartment. Lacking funds for surveillance cameras, I had to find alternative ways to track the nocturnal disturbers. Upon returning home, I searched through my belongings and found 2 old door bolts. Within an hour, these were installed on both the pantry and kitchen doors, externally securing them. If someone or something attempted to pass through these doors, they would encounter the hindrance of the bolts. I was content with my decision, but a lingering unease persisted. The next night, a loud, abrupt knock emanated from the kitchen, followed by the sound of a small metallic object hitting the floor. It seemed my makeshift barrier was not sufficient. Overwhelmed with fear, I froze, gripping my blanket tightly. No more sounds followed, and complete silence settled in. After about half an hour, I gathered my courage and decided to inspect the situation. Approaching the door cautiously, I slowly opened it, revealing a dark corridor. There was nothing visible, so I had to widen the door to get a better view. As I peered outside, a small hand appeared from around the corner, gripping the edge. Soon after, a head emerged, featuring abnormally large, bulging eyes 3 times the usual size. Long, dark hair hung down to the shoulders, and a partially open mouth formed a wide grin, stretching towards the ears. In sheer shock, I watched as the creature let out a soft wheeze. Breaking free from my stupor, I hastily retreated into my room, barricading the door with trembling hands. Terrifying thoughts swirled in my mind, questioning my sanity. The idea that a monstrous entity roamed my apartment at night, breaking through door bolts, seemed ludicrous. I sat on my bed, paralyzed, straining my ears for any sounds. It must have been hours before I awoke to the ringing of my morning alarm. Sitting there with a hammer in hand, I realized the door bolt from the kitchen had been torn off and lay in the corridor. The night had been a nightmarish blur, and I couldn't comprehend how such a bizarre creature could exist in my apartment, breaking through barriers. The unsettling realization dawned on me that I might be losing my mind. As I contemplated these thoughts, I felt a mixture of fear and confusion, uncertain about what the future held. Now it became clear that things were dire. I wasn't bothered by rats or other pests, but by some unknown paranormal entity. How to deal with it and what it wanted remained uncertain. However, retreating wasn't in my nature, even in the face of an unknown creature. For the first time in my life, I encountered something supernatural, and I wasn't just going to run away from it. In a discount store, I stumbled upon a bag of sprinkles, and an idea formed in my mind. I bought the sprinkles, and before going to bed, spread them on the floor in the kitchen and the corridor to facilitate a somewhat peaceful sleep. I barricaded the door to my room with a large wardrobe, No loud noises disturbed me, and no one bothered me. However, in the morning, I was baffled. Small, childlike footprints stretched from my room to the kitchen sink, ending abruptly there. At first glance, they resembled the footprints of a barefoot 10-year-old child, but closer inspection revealed something odd. Some had 6 toes, and others seemed to be made by someone walking on tiptoes. Looking at all this, I was far from pleased. Whatever creature visited me at night had a variety of footprints at its disposal. It was strange and horrifying, but damn it, I couldn't let it evict me from my apartment. On that day, I lingered at work and returned home very late, lacking the energy. I almost immediately went to sleep, thinking that the battle with monsters could wait, at least until no one touched me. I woke up in the deep night with a strong thirst. The last bottle of mineral water in my room had run out, so I had to go to the kitchen. All recent events flashed in my mind, and a strong fear gripped my chest. My heroic resolve vanished, replaced by a desire to hide and stay put. I hesitated for about 10 minutes, constantly listening and trying to calm myself. Finally, I forced myself to go to the kitchen as the unbearable thirst overcame my fear. I held a hammer in my hand and slowly and cautiously opened the door to the corridor, glancing in all directions. There was no one, and everything was quiet. Almost noiselessly, I headed down the corridor to the kitchen, constantly looking around. My hands slightly trembled with fear, and my heart beat furiously. I didn't turn on the lights anywhere to avoid unnecessary attention. Entering the kitchen, I saw nothing unusual. I quickly poured myself a glass of water and drank it in one gulp. At that moment, one of the hanging cabinets slowly opened, revealing the different horrifying creature entirely. A bold, pale head protruded through a small gap, staring at me with large black eyes. The creature's mouth froze in a crooked smile, consisting of incomplete rows of crooked and broken teeth. Perhaps it was the darkness, but the creature's eyes were of different sizes. The creature emitted a quiet wheeze and mumbled something incomprehensible. I began to step back, abruptly turning around, fearing that I might be surrounded. But there was no one behind me. The creature made another attempt to say something, and this time, I managed to decipher the word, "I'll take." I ran back to my room without waiting for it to do whatever it was planning to do. Locking myself in, I sat on the bed for almost the entire night. Only a couple of times did I hear the sounds of quiet and clumsy footsteps from the corridor and the kitchen. I fell asleep towards dawn, and upon waking up, felt far from my best. Apart from the open cabinets in the kitchen and slightly displaced shoes in the corridor, there were no signs of anyone else in the apartment. I didn't want to go to work, citing poor health, but we were finishing a major project those days, so losing time was not an option, at least due to fatigue and lack of sleep. The day passed in a haze, thoughts tangled, eyes stuck together, and a wild weakness in the body. When I returned from work, there was too little strength to do anything. The only consolation was that there was just one more day, and then the weekend would allow me to rest and figure out what was happening in the apartment. I just had to survive until then. A fleeting thought crossed my mind as I was falling asleep. How many times had I overslept before this? I couldn't manage to sleep through until morning. I woke up to the sound of the nightstand making noise. The door to the room was slightly ajar, and the nightstand was slightly shifted. I reached around with my hand and realized that this time I hadn't placed anything nearby for self-defense. At that moment, the door swung open abruptly and more forcefully. Pushing the obstacle I had set even further into the emerging gap, I saw some movement, but it was too dark to discern anything. Then, a brilliant idea crossed my mind. I swiftly grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and directed the beam of light towards the dark crevice. Another creature came into view, crawling on the floor. Its oval, pale face stood out in the darkness, and its open mouth was filled with numerous sharp and thin teeth. The creature's white eyes stared at me with a mad gaze. Before I turned on the light, it had crawled towards me, and now its emaciated hands froze, clutching the floor with long, crooked fingers. I stared at it, and it stared back at me for a few seconds before muttering something incomprehensible. "Hey," loudly, I said, and it twitched slightly but remained in place. It mumbled something again, and this time I managed to hear the word. It was damn scary, but I understood that my inaction could end badly. Thoughts about not showing fear crossed my mind. Continuing to shine the flashlight on the creature, I grabbed a pillow and threw it towards the monster with trembling hands. It leaped back, disappearing into the dark corridor. Fast retreating footsteps echoed. Silenced in the kitchen, I managed to scare it off. A joyful thought flashed in my mind. I quickly got up from the bed and closed the door, pushing a nightstand tightly against it. The fear receded a bit, but I still couldn't risk sleeping. Soon, the alarm clock rang, and I had to get ready for work. The door from the outside was slightly scratched, probably by the sharp claws of the terrifying creatures in the kitchen. Everything seemed fine except for one thing. The cabinet under the sink was slightly ajar. When I looked inside, I saw a hole in the concrete at the bottom, just a bit smaller than a human head. Many scratches and a few dark spots adorned the walls and the inner part of the cabinet. So that's what it is, I thought. However, at that moment, my phone rang. It was my boss, expressing concern that today everyone needed to be present, but there were still many problems to address. Glancing at the hole under the sink, I heroically decided that I could handle both work and dealing with the creatures when I returned home in the evening. By the end of the day, my strength was running low, and my determination to fight unknown entities dwindled. But still, I wouldn't surrender my home to these creatures. Exhausted, I mumbled to myself as I grabbed an axe from the closet. Before locking myself in the room with it, I scattered rat poison in the cabinet under the sink. Maybe one of the creatures would try it and get poisoned. Night fell, and I sat on the bed with the axe in hand. The phone lay nearby, ready to call the police if necessary. 1 hour passed, then another, but no one came. Eventually, I unwittingly drifted off to sleep. Upon waking up, I initially couldn't grasp what was happening, caught in a half-asleep state. However, after a minute, I realized that the door to my room was wide open, and someone was standing in the corridor. I fumbled around the bed in search of my phone, but it was nowhere to be found. Grabbing the axe, I examined what was in the corridor. It was quite dark, but I managed to see her. She resembled a 10-year-old girl in a dress. A wide, malevolent smile froze on her face, and her eyes glinted strangely in the darkness. The decaying skin on her face was visible even in the dim light. "Hey!" I yelled with fear in my voice. The eerie girl raised her hand, pointing at me, and croaked something incomprehensible. I stood up, still holding the axe. Thoughts raced through my mind. I had to be ready if they tried to attack me. In that instant, someone grabbed my legs, causing me to lose balance and crash to the floor. The axe slipped from my hands and flew into the corridor. I looked back and saw the creature with mismatched eyes and a twisted smile emerging from under the bed. It clamped onto my leg with a death grip, muttering something under its breath. I kicked it away, breaking free from its grasp, and reached for the axe. I couldn't get hold of it because the ghastly girl sank her teeth into my shoulder. A brief numbing pain coursed through my body, but then, with a swift blow, I managed to detach the creature from me, and it collapsed to the floor. The deformed creature again seized my leg. However, this time, I already had the axe in my hands. The first strike hit its long appendage, and it began to mumble incomprehensibly, the strange voice echoing faster and louder. The voice sounded like a blend of irritating, creaking, and scratching sounds, manipulated into a semblance of speech. Glancing towards the kitchen, I saw 2 more entities in the corridor. One crawled towards me, its large white eyes bulging. I recognized it from the previous night. The other, resembling a deformed skeleton with slightly flattened head, peeked from around the corner. Realizing that the horrifying creatures were becoming too numerous, I made the only right decision: to get out of there. Quickly opening the entrance door, I sprinted into the hallway and then onto the street. It dawned on me that my hand still clutched the bloodied axe. I tossed it onto the grass nearby. My phone remained somewhere in the apartment, and I couldn't immediately call the police. After a couple of minutes, I encountered a passerby who, upon seeing my distressed state, promptly called both the police and an ambulance. I lied, claiming that burglars had invaded my apartment and attempted to kill me. In self-defense, I fled from the apartment. When they checked it, they found no severed limbs, only blood on the floor and a hole under the sink. Following this incident, I moved to another apartment. Despite trying to portray myself as a hero throughout that time, I now needed psychological assistance. Only in the last week have I stopped waking up at night, fearfully listening to every sound. Just yesterday, I learned from the news that in that very same apartment, they discovered the dismembered body of a man. His remains were found under the sink, next to the newly patched hole in the floor.